children, I, at some point, tied a blanket around my neck and zoomed around my backyard pretending I could fly. I stared as hard as possible as I could at the objects around me, willing them to move with my mind powers. But my very best efforts as a child and now admittedly as an adult, to my utter disappointment, I'm not a superhero. I can't fly or move objects with my mind or leap tall buildings with a single bound. So I'm not a superhero, but let me tell you a secret. I can make part of myself invisible. It's true, and you might actually have that ability too. In fact, a large percentage of the people have this function of invisibility, but it isn't a superpower. It's the unfortunate aspect of having part of who I am go unrecognized and the feeling of being isolated because of it. What I'm talking about is disability. My name is Dr. Caitlin Graves. I am gay, neurodivergent, and I have a disability. Now, if I came up and shook your hand and introduced myself, you might be a little taken aback. So that's because we usually don't present a diversity resume when we meet people, right? When we think about diversity, what that means, what do we think of? Race, ethnicity, gender, religion, sexuality, age. But what about disability status? Disability is one of the primary areas of identity within diversity, but it's often not the first one that springs to mind or the primary that's put on the forefront of DEI efforts. And that's because of the invisible aspects. So I'm gay, neurodivergent, and disabled. Those are three aspects that make me diverse, but you can't see them. So much of what makes us diverse is invisible. You might guess that I'm gay if you saw me holding hands with my wife, which I like to do as much as possible. But you would be very hard-pressed to see my neurodivergence and disability unless you saw me reacting to them. So there's so much going on in the way of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts these days. You see companies, organizations, colleges come out and talk about the efforts that they're putting in to diversity, equity, inclusion. It's been a hot-button issue for many years. I personally spent most of my career actually doing DEI work, especially in higher education. So I think it's good and necessary that we are making these efforts. There's a piece missing of the puzzle, and that piece is in the shape of disability. When you see statistics of a workforce, it talks about percentages of persons of color, gender, sexuality, but really that only comes up during Pride Month. But what do organizations talk about when they're talking about disability? When was the last time you saw an organization or a company say an X percentage of our workforce is disabled? What about coming out for certain days of disability? Autism Awareness Month, we'll make a statement. Invisible Disability Awareness Month, did you even know that existed? A tweet there, a post there, a banner up in the headquarters. Anything lasting? And ultimately, it's not recognized and not addressed. In fact, according to a report from the Return on Disability Group, 90% of companies claim to prioritize diversity. 90%. But only 4% of them include disability within that. I think a big reason is because so much of disability is actually invisible. Today I'm going to share with you about my own invisible disability and how it affects me. And then I'm going to propose 4 steps you can take to start addressing this disability gap. What comes to mind when you think of someone with a disability? Someone who's physically impaired, so maybe they'll use a walker or a wheelchair. Someone who is hard of hearing or deaf, so maybe they use an interpreter or hearing aids. Someone who has a missing or an amputated limb. Someone who's visually impaired. And all of these are correct, but you're scratching the surface in examples. According to the US Census, 1 in 5 people have a disability. 1 in 5. That's 58 million people in the country, 20%. And according to the World Health Organization, 1 billion people worldwide have a disability. So let's bring this down to a number we can comprehend, 1 in 5. So there are 200 people in this theater. 40 of those people then have a disability. And you might have been saying when the lights were up, well, I didn't see 40 people that looked like they maybe had a cane or were wearing hearing aids, and that's true. That's because 25% of disabilities are those you can see. The other 75%, they're like me. They have an invisible disability. The Invisible Disabilities Association defines invisible disability as a physical, mental, or neurological condition that is not visible from the outside, yet can limit or challenge a person's movements, senses, or activities. Ultimately, the very fact that these disabilities are invisible can lead to misunderstandings, false perceptions, and judgments. Some common invisible disabilities are fibromyalgia, diabetes, traumatic brain injuries, autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, dyslexia, epilepsy, post-traumatic stress syndrome, and the list goes on. Now, not everyone who has what is classified as a disability would consider themselves disabled. You might actually be having that thought, since I gave you that 1 in 5 statistic. That is because, quite simply, disability is a spectrum, and you might actually not find your disability that disabling. I don't actually think of my neurodivergence as a disability. To me, it's just how I process and react to the world. But my chronic condition, that's a little different. So I have what is called chronic migraine. And the threshold for chronic migraine is 15 migraine days a month. But I am an overachiever. Over time, migraines have become an everyday occurrence for me. They ebb and flow in intensity and accompanying symptoms. And if you never had a migraine, that is good for you. I do actually genuinely mean that. But let me tell you, it's so much more than a headache. There are a vast number of symptoms, and not all of them show up all at once or at all. For me, it affects many of my symptoms. It affects my eyes, blurring the world and making me very sensitive to light. Super fun with these. It makes me sound sensitive. It makes my skin sensitive, so it'll make me feel like I have a sunburn. In gross news, it makes me nauseous all the time, and I will vomit at times and in places I really wish I wouldn't, like a job interview. It's happened twice. I have dexterity issues. It makes me clumsy. I drop things. I am unsteady on my feet. I fall. My migraines also affect my speech. I get aphasia, which means I struggle with speaking clearly or having my words understood. I'll stumble over my speech, losing the word I'm trying to say, called word searching. I'll even start slurring my words, sometimes a little, fortunately sometimes a lot. Migraine also affects your memory. So when you have them all the time, you have what I call my Swiss cheese brain. They're holes. I'm funny. So of all these things I mentioned, you cannot see them unless you see me reacting to them. I'm invisible, and I don't like it, because like I said, and I don't like it not just because I have to deal with a chronic illness, but because when you cannot see something, it doesn't get recognized. So how do we go about recognizing invisible disabilities, including the people who have them in our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts? My very first step for you: disabled and disability are not dirty words. But these are the terms that a large part of society doesn't like to use. They're terms that are whispered. Disability and disabled are seen as abnormal, a deficiency, and always, always negative. There's this huge stigma, and that's part of the reason why people who have a disability either don't consider themselves disabled or are hesitant to share that they are, for fear of ridicule, underestimation, and backlash. There's also a general misunderstanding about how broad the definition is. I myself didn't realize I had a disability when I really should have. It just didn't occur to me. Unlike knowing I was gay, it took until my 20s to actually get my neurodivergence diagnosis, although upon reflection, it made a lot more sense. I was actually quite shocked to find chronic migraine under a list of common invisible disabilities. Yet, and this was years after my diagnosis, pain in my body had become synonymous with one another, but it never clicked that it was a disability. And I'm in good company because disability is not uncommon. It's 1 in 5, remember? Affecting people across race, gender, and socioeconomic status. Though I would be remiss to mention that those of lower socioeconomic status and other underserved populations historically have fewer resources to assist with disability accommodations, specialized programming, and medical access. And while it might be a surprise to some of us to see the conditions we have labeled as a disability, maybe you don't want to think of yourself as having a disability because there's that stigma. Maybe I'm the first to tell you this, but disabled isn't a dirty word. It's a good thing because actually the term and the definition exist to give access. The legal definition, according to the Americans with Disabilities Act, is a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. Examples of major life activities include breathing, walking, talking, hearing, seeing, sleeping, caring for oneself, and working. But also major bodily functions, such as immune system functions, normal cell growth, digestive, bowel, neurological, respiratory, circulatory, endocrine, and reproductive functions. Even the term differently abled is othering. Differently abled, like we got to swap out our disabilities for superpowers. Now, I don't know if I just missed something, but I didn't get this option. I didn't get super strength when I lost the ability to move my arm. I didn't get laser vision, would have been cool, when I have vision issues, and I certainly didn't get aphasia. I do get aphasia. Case in point. And I certainly did not get the ability to read minds when I get aphasia. Me getting through my day doesn't make me any more extraordinary than anyone else, but if we do have the ability to get superpowers, I would like to speak to whomever's in charge. So as you begin this journey towards addressing the gap, remember the first step, a disability is not a dirty word. There are a lot of terms that are inappropriate or derogatory, but a proper term is not one of them. Because when you soften words or use incorrect terms, you further the othering and invisibility of those with disabilities. The second step towards addressing this disability gap is to stop othering disabled people. The othering happens in a few ways. On another TED Talk stage, the late Stella Young called it inspiration porn. That is the inspiration for non-disabled people by disabled people because of their disability. People like to virtue signal on social media especially. They'll share a picture of someone with running blades completing a marathon, someone with a learning disability completing a degree. Look at this person, they succeeded despite their illness, despite their neurodivergence, despite their insert disability here. People see someone living their typical life and they call them brave, amazing, miracles, inspirations. They call them superheroes. And that's not to discount the effort that they put in or the fact that, disability makes things difficult sometimes. Disability does make things harder depending upon what your disability is, but it's inspiration, exploitation. Disabled bodies and people do not exist for objectification or inspiration. Third, suspend limitations. Don't assume that someone can or cannot do something. Let the person tell you what they need if they do need something. I guarantee unless a person has been injured in that moment, they know what they need. They have been living in their bodies and in their minds far longer than you have witnessed them. Now, people with disabilities are pretty good at adapting, and they know what they need and what they can and cannot do. Now, some people like to ignore those things, like myself, but that's more of a me problem. Finally, and this takes us into our fourth and final step I have for you today, focus on the E and the I of DEI. Diversity is great. It gets people in the door, maybe amplifies them a little bit. But equity and inclusion are what truly amplifies and also keeps people where they're at. People with disabilities, besides being chameleons and invisible, are pretty good at adapting to the world. The world needs to adapt to them. Equity, there's this practice called universal design, where you accommodate for the needs and abilities of all and eliminate unnecessary hurdles. On the whole, it means making products, communications, and the environment more usable by as many people as possible. The Americans with Disabilities Act requires a minimum standard. It sets the floor, not the ceiling. With the percentage of people with disabilities being so high, no matter what you do, a program you manage, a document you put out for work, an assignment you set for class, a large event like this one, or even a small one, you're going to touch people that have disabilities. Making things equally accessible for people with disabilities without them having to ask for it, that is equity. What's left is the I, inclusion. This may sound simple, but include people with varying disabilities in purposely addressing this gap. A broad range, not just one, never just one. And also within people with variety of abilities, because there are intersectionalities you should be aware of. There's a saying in the disabled community, nothing about us without us. That's something you can take for equity and inclusion anywhere. We've established that so much of disability is invisible, and you might wonder how you're going to know if someone has a disability or not. The answer is, you're not. They're going to have to tell you. I thought I was done coming out of closets, but I'm not. There's a disability closet as well, and you have to create an inclusive culture, one where it's safe to self-identify. And as you build this culture and people begin to feel more comfortable, it fosters a sense of belonging. Otherwise, you're members of an organization, employers, colleagues, friends will continue to be invisible. These are my hot tips. Disability and disabled are not dirty words. Stop othering and limiting. Focus on the E and the I. It can be easily summed up as radically recognizing disability and making efforts to include and accommodate. You have to have both. They go hand in hand. Defining this invisible disability can open doors of communication and understanding, but you have to make the efforts visible, even if the disability is not. I don't speak for the whole of the disabled community. As I've covered, we are a large and mighty group. As you come across us, and you will, keep in mind you may never know the internal battle that someone is fighting, especially with invisible disability. Disability doesn't recognize you have a big day coming up. You usually can't schedule it in or put it to the side when you don't feel like dealing with it. I appreciate you listening today. Truth be told, I didn't actually know how this morning was going to go. I got nervous to tell the organizers who have worked so hard to put this on and have been so incredibly patient that I don't know how I'm going to be like when you need me to speak. And that's not because I don't like public speaking. It's because I don't know if you're going to get the Caitlin that looks and sounds normal, or will that mask of invisibility drop? Will your brain break and I forget all or half of my speech? Well, how will I sound? Will my words be able to be understood? Will I be able to stand the lights? No matter the form I've come to you today, I hope I've given you something to think on and broadened your understanding of the definition and identification of disability. I pass the cape on to you now for you to take these steps and change the world with them. Go forward and radically recognize disability and work on closing that gap through heroic effort, superhuman strength or not. Because we in the disabled community cannot do it alone. Because as I said, we are not superheroes, at least not yet.